Hello, welcome to my PhD project. What led me to pursue this topic was my interest in nature that I've had since a very young age. Even before I moved to Ventura, I was very curious about the wild, and more importantly, how I could take advantage of the natural resources and potentially live off of them. My research first led me to a very simple yet very useful rule. The rule of threes. 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, and 30 days without food. In Southern California, we don't have to worry about a lack of oxygen. Since that need is checked off our list, that leads me to the second most important rule, shelter. The rule dictates that you can survive 3 hours without shelter, so it's crucial that shelter is available. I've found multiple methods of creating or finding shelter that could check this problem off our list. I will present evidence of shelter that I've constructed before, explain the pros and cons to each one of those methods, and I will show you the process of how I construct a shelter. Firstly, here's a simple lean-to shelter. It provides good insulation and protection from rain and wind. This is because of its sloped roof. This sloped roof allows me to stack more insulation because gravity holds it down. The simplicity is an advantage of this shelter, but also a disadvantage in other ways. It's very small and leaves open spaces to either side, but is very easy to construct. Next, we have a much larger and complex standing shelter. It's been constructed of multiple ridge poles resting against this tree. Normally, the poles would fall, but I selected a tree that branches off into a fork, so I can securely place the ridge poles there. This is one of my far more complex shelter, and it took me more time. The shelter provides me with great insulation and protection from the elements, and gives me an enclosed area. Lastly, for shelters that I have previously constructed, here's an A-frame shelter that I constructed with light insulation. This is by far the most simple of the three. It provides less insulation and protection from wind or rain, but in a pinch it could help you in a time of need. I use this fallen tree as an easy way to construct this shelter. Keeping an eye out for abnormalities like this can save you time and energy. Now it's time to move on to the shelter that I'm going to show you how to construct. The first step to take when building a shelter like this is securing poles into the ground. I chose to dig a pit to do this, as you can see here. Now that the pit is complete, I'm going to place a pole into the ground. As you can see, it took me a couple of attempts to get a nice sturdy foothold for the pole. After I got the pole in, I laid some stones for reinforcement. This will counteract any sort of instability that may occur, and it'll just make the structure a lot more secure, and it'll be able to hold a lot more weight without slipping. After I completed getting the pole into the ground and somewhat stable, I put some dirt over it and stamped it into the ground to ensure the stability of it. And after that, I decided to place some extra stones for reinforcement just so I could be 100% certain that this pole is not going to slip or fall. After I was finished with the first pole, I repeated the same process 5 to 6 feet away from the first pole. This is the beginning to the archway I'm going to create that we can lay this insulation and poles onto. After both of these poles are placed into the ground securely, you're going to want to put something between the two to act as a ridge pole to lay the poles onto. I chose to use 2 sticks so I could have some extra stability and strength. As you can see here, I can do a proper pull-up on these, and I weigh 130 pounds. This represents the strength of this structure and how much weight I can put onto it. Now that we have the ridge pole and archway complete of our shelter, it's essential that we make some sort of scaffolding to place the insulation on so we can have a backing to our shelter. Now, for the choice of pole to use, I chose to use something very similar to bamboo, because with bamboo it's long, it's straight, and those are the two things you're going to need. It doesn't need to be the strongest, and this material isn't the strongest, but it can support the amount of weight that I'm going to be putting on it, so it checks that box, and there's not many other materials out there that can be as long and straight as this. For the next step, I begin to actually put some of the insulation onto the scaffolding by weaving this palm frond through the actual poles. This will act as insulation in of itself, but you can also now lay smaller poles that can't reach all the way up to the ridge pole, so you can use all of the materials available. Now we can begin to place the smaller stalks onto the shelter. This will create more insulation, and as these sticks and stalks are placed onto the shelter, we can then place lighter and more flexible materials through the stalks by weaving or just as I did on the smaller lean-to shelter, they can be held down by gravity, such as with these palm fronds. Now that the backing is complete, your shelter is essentially finished. If you're in an area where wind could be a problem, it'd be smarter to put up some sort of walls on the side. I chose to just make a light frame on the side to act as walls because in this enclosed area, this little clearing that I found, there is no wind. It gets filtered out through all of the trees, so that's an advantage. You're going to want to find out a nice place to put your shelter. I've gotten that from a variety of my sources, from my mentor, all the way up to at least half of the videos that I've watched on shelter. Now that we have the backing and the rudimentary walls complete, the shelter is finished. The lean-to shelter was a shelter suggested by many of the videos I watched, such as by Smooth Jetfix, the German channel. They make some great videos, especially ones with shelter involved. They're really good at what they do. Same thing with my one of the books I read by Dave Canterbury, his book on bushcraft. He suggested that if you're going out for an outing, then a natural shelter that you can build would be a lean-to, like the one I built here. My mentor did not suggest it though. She suggested something more similar to a Chumash design, but that's more of a taller enclosed shelter, a lot more complex than this. I've found in my own hours out on the field that the lean-to shelter is superior. It's the best one. If you're going to be out here for much longer, then an A-frame might be better because that encloses you completely from anything, really, rain, wind, all of that. It's a much more complex, well-designed shelter. I would consider fire to be part of the shelter rule because fire is one of the most important tools that you'll have. It can keep you warm, it can cook food and boil water to sanitize it, and on top of that, it can ward off wild animals that are curious about your camp. For the first method, I'll show you the fire steel. You move the steel along the magnesium rod, harder rather than faster and lighter. This will produce many more sparks, then that gives you a higher chance to actually get your fire started. For all of these examples, you'll want to use a dry and flammable tinder. If you shape the tinder into a bird's nest, then it will be able to catch the sparks easier. After you have your tinder lit, you can move it into the fire pit and gradually add sticks. The next method is the magnifying glass. This method cannot always be used like the fire steel can because the sun needs to be shining, and shining pretty bright at that. You will want to focus the lens in a way that can get as much sunlight shining through it as possible, and in the smallest, most confined point. Aim this point at the previously mentioned tinder pile and wait for it to smolder and then light. This method is simple, but it relies on sunlight. The next method is the bow drill. This method relies on many parts and is not as simple as other methods. An upside to that is that it can be created by all natural materials. If you were to find yourself in a situation where you're unprepared, the bow drill can be life or death. You operate this method by applying pressure to the fireboard with your foot and pressure to the socket with your hand. This will hold the drill in place as you pull the bow back and forth rapidly, creating lots of friction. This friction will start an ember in the fireboard, and then this ember will fall into the catch. Now that you have the ember, you can use the catch to move it into the tinder pile. This method is reliable but complex. A tip that I learned from one of my favorite sources was suggested by a man named Alfie. He suggests that you wear a durable cord as your shoelace. I chose 550 paracord because of its strength and durability. A normal shoelace can be used as the cord for a bow drill, but it will be less reliable. A sort of subsection of the bow drill, so to speak, is the hand drill, which is the same thing essentially, except instead of a bow and a cord, it's operated merely with just the spindle and the fireboard. This can result in blisters on your hands, so that's why the bow drill is superior to it, but if you need to make a much more simpler method, a hand drill will suffice. Those methods that I presented should more than cover your fire needs. If one doesn't work for whatever reason, for example, the sun may not be shining, you may not have dry wood to create the bow drill, one or the other should suffice to create a fire for whatever the purpose may be. All of my sources from YouTube suggest the bow drill, fire steel, and magnifying glass. My mentor disagrees. She suggests the hand drill, surprisingly, despite the negative effects. I personally find the fire steel to be the most effective and efficient method of fire from my experience out on the field. Now that we have shelter secured, we should move on to the third most important rule: water. The rule dictates that you can last 3 days without water, so it's crucial that you find a water source and find a method to purify that water. Just as there are multiple methods for fire varying in simplicity, there are also various methods of purifying water that vary in their own simplicity. Firstly, simply boiling water will suffice. The CDC dictates that water is only safe to drink after it's been boiled. This method is broad because there are many ways to get water boiling. Placing a metal container full of water close enough to the flames or coals can get the water to a boil, but it's more efficient to make a tripod and hang the container from it over the fire. I got this tip from a man named Dave Canterbury in his book by the name of Bushcraft 101. If you have a container that cannot be put near flames or coals, or don't have one at all, this next method will be easier for you. Let's say you have some sort of plastic water bottle. An easy way to get the water boiling without melting or warping the plastic is to heat a small stone capable of being placed in the water bottle. Once it's red hot, pick it up with sticks and place it into the bottle of water. The water will flash boil violently, so be careful. If you're able to place a small piece of tree bark at the bottom, acting as a barrier for the plastic, it will not warp or melt the bottom of the bottle. If you don't have a container to begin with, you can make one. An easy way to make one is to make a cavity in a log. Make sure that this log is not rotten. This is to ensure that the log will not leak any of the water that you place inside of it. Once you have a cavity in the log, move some coals over from your fire pit and place them inside of the cavity. Blow on the coals and let them make a thin layer of charcoal along the inside of the cavity. This will help even more at holding the water. Next, like in the previous method, move a heated stone into the water. All of my sources have suggested boiling water as an easy way to purify it. Different ones have suggested different methods, but I have found from my own experience that just simply boiling the water over the fire works best, and if you don't have a container to do so, the stone method also works very well. One of the most useful skills to have is the ability to make cordage out of natural materials. I have found that with a little patience and skill, you can make cordage out of nearly any kind of grass or fibrous plant. I learned this once again from Dave Canterbury in his book on bushcraft. He calls it the reverse wrap 2-ply cordage. It's very easy to master with only a little bit of practice. You started off by selecting 3 to 4 fibers that are strong and flexible. Twist these fibers until they naturally crease over themselves, making a small knot. From here, simply twist one of the 2 diverging strands and then pull the other non-twisted strand over. Repeating this process will eventually leave you with a long piece of cordage. Cordage is necessary to create certain types of shelter and the previously mentioned tripod. It can also be used for many other kinds of lashings and tie-downs. I've found that yucca is the best material for cordage, but every other material is good in its own right. So don't get me wrong, they're all great, but I've found that yucca is the best. Now that we have covered both shelter and water, we should move on to food. The rule dictates that you can last 30 days without food, or around 3 weeks. So let's start off with a simple one, a very abundant springtime food, lemongrass. Lemongrass can be defined by its clover-like appearance. It's also got hollow stalks. They're very thin, and once it's springtime, full springtime, they bloom these beautiful yellow flowers. It's very hard to miss them, and an easy way to instantly know if it's lemongrass, take off a small amount of the leaf. If it's not sour when you taste it, it is not lemongrass. Do not eat it. Next, we have nettle, which is a potential danger as well as a food source. It can be very irritating to the skin and can cause a rash. It's very nutritious, and you can cook it over the fire to remove all of these little stinging prawns that will cause the rash. Once it's cooked over there, then it's completely safe to eat. Make sure you cook it well, because it would not be good to get any of that down your throat. After nettle, we have wild blackberry. This can easily be defined by its small, pin-like thorns on it. They're red in coloration most of the year, and it looks dangerously similar to poison oak. Once again, an easy way to identify it apart from poison oak is by its very thin needle-like pins going all along the vine. Next, we have dandelion, which can be easily identified by its large yellow flower growing off of its big central stalk. There are bigger serrated leaves growing out from the center of the stalk, and it can be eaten for its leaves, its root, its stalk, pretty much anything. Just make sure you're eating dandelion. Make sure you're eating everything that's listed. Do not eat something unless you're 100% certain that it is the correct thing, because eating the incorrect thing could potentially kill you. This is why I chose to avoid mushrooms in this topic, because eating one bad mushroom could get you sick or worse. Next, I'd like to describe what I know to be heart walnuts. They're much smaller, much smaller. They're a wild version of the bigger, more domesticated walnuts that we know. They have a much thicker shell as well, so you're going to want to bash it in with some kind of rock. The inner meat has fats, it has certain proteins, and it has carbs in it. It's very useful. It can help you out if you need a quick snack, or if you want to add it into a larger stew, it would be great for that. Next, we have three methods of protein. I chose not to research any larger game hunting or even small game hunting. The biggest thing that I've gone to is very small poultry, such as crawfish and minnows, and even at that, I chose not to hunt them because that would be illegal. In the state of California, it's considered a take to encroach on the river, such as the one we have here in Ventura, so I chose to abide by the law and not go down there and catch any of them. I do know the necessary steps that I would need to take to catch some if I were in a survival situation, though. A sustainable yet gross way of sustaining protein is worms and grubs. You can find grubs inside or under rotten logs, and you can find worms in places that would retain moisture throughout the day, such as under stones or also under logs. It's just as important to maintain mental health as physical health, so I will suggest that you put these in some sort of stew or at least cook them before you eat them. Placing them in a stew will give you many benefits, actually, even more if you add wild green edibles to the mix. All of the foods that I have suggested are plants and animals that I know by heart to be edible. One of my most reliable sources, Dave Canterbury, suggests that you find 5 good grains and 2 meats. I couldn't agree more with this, and it's allowed me to focus more on a small amount of reliable sources of food. This project has allowed me to pursue passions that I've wanted to pursue for quite a while now, and I know for a fact that I'll continue to pursue them well on my way through high school. As I push myself through high school, I will continue to learn more and more skills, whether that be from books, articles, videos, or just experience on the field. By the end of this project, I'm certainly sure that I cover the rule of threes perfectly. And if it were to come down to it, I know I could survive out there. I hope that my PhD project has been able to convey that well. Thank you all for watching.